Three limestone coffins sat undisturbed for centuries in the monastery's ancient crypt, waiting for the monks who would eventually occupy them. But Brother Augustus never expected they would be filled so suddenly or under such horrifying circumstances. 7 years after three young monks vanished without a trace from St. Benedict's monastery, leaving behind half-eaten meals and unfinished prayers, a team of spelunkers made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the religious community. Deep within an unmapped cavern system beneath the monastery grounds, researchers stumbled upon a hidden grotto untouched for generations. Their headlamps illuminated a scene that defied explanation. Three sets of monks' robes arranged in a perfect triangle around a crude stone altar. Skeletal remains scattered among ritual objects that had no place in Christian worship. Most disturbing of all was the ancient manuscript clutched in one skeleton's bony fingers, its pages open to passages that had been forbidden by the Church for nearly 8 centuries. If you've ever been fascinated by unsolved mysteries that blend the sacred with the profoundly disturbing, you're in the right place. This haunting story explores the boundaries between faith, forbidden knowledge, and the darkness that sometimes lurks within holy places. Where are you watching from today? Have you ever visited an ancient monastery or experienced something unexplainable in a religious setting? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're new here, join our Last Seen community by hitting subscribe. We investigate disappearances that challenge conventional explanations. This particular case will test your beliefs about what lies beyond the veil of our understanding. Brother Augustus sat in the dimly lit archives of St. Benedict's Monastery, surrounded by the remnants of a 7-year investigation that had yielded nothing but dead ends. Yellowing missing person flyers with the smiling faces of brothers Matthew, Luke, and John were pinned to a corkboard, their edges curling with age. Police reports formed precarious stacks on his desk, alongside weather-worn maps marked with search grids that had been combed over countless times. A single desk lamp cast long shadows across the stone walls, illuminating the lined face of a man who had aged decades in just 7 years. At 62, Brother Augustus's once black beard had gone completely white, his shoulders permanently hunched from countless hours bent over ancient texts and modern police reports. As the monastery's archivist, he had always found comfort among these shelves of knowledge. Now they felt like silent witnesses to his failure. He rubbed his tired eyes and set down the report he'd been reviewing, the one detailing the final confirmed sightings of his 3 missing brothers. His gaze drifted to the small window where moonlight streamed through leaded glass, casting diamond patterns on the stone floor. Perhaps tonight he would finally accept what the others had years ago, that his brothers were never coming home. St. Benedict's Monastery stood as it had for over 8 centuries, stone walls rising from the mountainside in northern Spain's Picos de Europa, isolated and self-sufficient. Founded in 1187, it had survived wars, plagues, and political upheavals, its remote location serving as both protection and prison for those who sought a life of contemplation. The complex consisted of the main chapel, with its soaring bell tower, dormitory wings flanking a central courtyard, working areas for various crafts, and the extensive library and archives where Augustus had dedicated his life. The monastery's daily rhythm had continued uninterrupted for centuries. Matins at 5 a.m. when the brothers rose in darkness, lauds at dawn, followed by private study and communal work. Midday prayers, afternoon contemplation, vespers at sunset, and finally compline before the great silence fell at night. This predictable pattern had been the foundation of Augustus's existence for 40 years, providing structure and meaning to a life dedicated to God. Before the disappearance, the monastery had housed 17 monks,
a tight-knit community where each member played vital roles in maintaining their isolated existence. Brother Thomas oversaw the kitchen gardens, Brother Philip maintained the beehives, and elderly Brother Sebastian served as spiritual advisor to the younger monks. The three who vanished had been among the most promising of the younger generation. Brother Matthew, at 34, had been the scholarly historian with a particular interest in the monastery's founding. Tall and lanky, with wire-rimmed glasses perpetually sliding down his nose, he spoke 5 languages and had been entrusted with organizing the monastery's most ancient documents. His quarters had always been in meticulous order, books arranged by subject and language, notes carefully labeled and cross-referenced. Luke, 29, had served as the choir director, blessed with a tenor voice that seemed to belong to the angels themselves. Charismatic and outgoing as much as monastery life allowed, he'd brought life to their ceremonies with innovative arrangements of traditional chants. Where Matthew was reserved, Luke was expressive, his hands constantly moving when he spoke, his laughter filling the stone corridors. John, at 27, had been the youngest and quietest of the 3. As the monastery's herbalist, he'd maintained the medicinal garden and prepared remedies for everything from Brother Vincent's arthritis to Brother Dominic's persistent cough. John had a gentle touch with plants and people alike, often speaking just above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the air around him. His knowledge of local flora was unmatched, having been raised in a nearby village before joining the order at 17. Outside the monastery's walls, Detective Isabella Herrera had led the official investigation. Even now, 7 years later, she still called Augustus every few months, though her superiors had reassigned her to more recent cases years ago. A seasoned investigator with the Guardia Civil's Missing Persons Unit, Herrera had never formally closed the file. Some cases get under your skin, she had told Augustus during her last visit. This is one of them. At 45, Herrera was known for her methodical approach and unrelenting persistence. She'd built her reputation solving cases others had abandoned, earning the nickname La Sabuesa, the Bloodhound, among her colleagues. The disappearance of 3 monks from a remote monastery should have been straightforward, either an accident in the mountains or a willing departure from their vows. But something about this case had never made sense to her, and like Augustus, she couldn't let it go. The morning of April 17, 2004, had begun like any other at St. Benedict's Monastery. The bell tower had rung out at 5 a.m., calling the brothers from their simple cells to the chapel for matins. Brother Augustus, responsible for ringing that bell, had noted all 17 monks present for the first prayers of the day, including brothers Matthew, Luke, and John. Breakfast had followed in the refectory, simple fare of dark bread, honey from the monastery's hives, and herbal tea. Brother Camus recalled the 3 sitting together at the end of the long wooden table, speaking in hushed tones, their conversation punctuated by occasional glances at a small leather notebook Matthew kept close. Nothing unusual for Matthew, who always seemed to be researching something.
Morning prayers had proceeded normally, though Brother Sebastian later mentioned that Luke's voice had carried a strange intensity during the chanting, as if each note contained a message beyond the sacred texts. After prayers, the brothers had dispersed to their daily tasks, Matthew to the archives, Luke to practice with 2 novices who showed musical promise, and John to gather herbs from a mountainside as he did each spring. It was Brother John who had first mentioned the cave. 2 weeks earlier, while foraging higher on the slopes than usual, he discovered what appeared to be a narrow opening in the rock face, partially concealed by juniper bushes. He'd mentioned it casually during the midday meal, describing how cold air flowed from the entrance, suggesting a larger system beyond. "You could feel it," he'd said, eyes bright with discovery, "like the mountain was breathing." Brother Gregory, who had been tending goats near the monastery for 50 years, claimed to have heard stories from his grandfather about caves beneath the monastery, places the old shepherds avoided, saying they led to the pagan underworld that had existed before the Christians built their stone walls above. That afternoon, several brothers observed Matthew, Luke, and John preparing for what appeared to be a short expedition. Brother Dominic saw them in the kitchen, packing bread and dried fruit into cloth sacks. Brother Vincent encountered them near the tool shed, where they collected 3 sturdy walking sticks and a coil of rope. Most significantly, Brother Philip watched them fill leather flasks with water at the well, noting Luke's excitement. "We're going exploring," he'd told him, with an uncharacteristic wink. "John's found something interesting on the mountain." Brother Augustus was the last to see them. Passing through the corridor that connected the main chapel to the dormitory wing, he'd encountered Matthew emerging from the archives, carefully locking the door behind him. "Brother," Augustus had greeted him, "you seem to be in a hurry." Matthew had startled slightly, tucking something into his pocket. "Just joining John and Luke for an afternoon walk," he'd replied, his voice deliberately casual. "John believes he's found a cave entrance that might connect to the old stories." Augustus had noticed something unusual, a small bronze key on a leather cord around Matthew's neck, one he'd never seen before. When he inquired about it, Matthew had touched it briefly, then tucked it beneath his robe. "Just something I found in the archives," he'd said. "Probably nothing important, but interesting nonetheless." With that cryptic statement, he'd hurried away, leaving Augustus puzzling over the encounter. It was the last time anyone at St. Benedict's would see brothers Matthew, Luke, or John alive. When the 3 failed to return for evening prayers, Brother Augustus initially felt only mild concern. The mountain paths could be treacherous, and perhaps they'd gone farther than planned. When they missed Compline, the final prayers before the Great Silence, worry began to spread among the brothers. By midnight, with no sign of their return, the monastery was in silent turmoil. At dawn, after a sleepless night, Augustus organized the first search party. 6 brothers set out along the paths commonly used for herb gathering, calling the missing monks' names, their voices echoing back from stone cliffs. They returned at midday with nothing to report. The abbot, an austere man of few words, authorized Augustus to break the monastery's usual isolation and seek outside help. By afternoon, local police had arrived, followed by mountain rescue teams with trained dogs. The search expanded, grid by grid, covering the rugged terrain surrounding the monastery. For 3 days, helicopters circled overhead, while searchers combed through dense brush and scaled rocky outcroppings. The dogs tracked the brothers' scent to a point high on the mountainside, where it simply vanished near a sheer rock face. Officers documented a disturbed area where juniper bushes had been recently pushed aside, revealing what might have been a narrow opening. But when they investigated, they found only solid rock, as if the mountain had closed whatever door had briefly opened. "It doesn't make sense," the search coordinator had told Augustus on the 4th day. 3 grown men don't just disappear without leaving some trace, footprints, clothing fibers, something. But they had. No equipment was found abandoned on the trails, no blood evidence suggesting an accident, no signs of struggle indicating foul play. As one officer put it, it's as if the mountain swallowed them whole. As days turned to weeks, the intensity of the search diminished. The dogs were called off, the helicopters returned to their bases, and the number of officers dwindled. After 6 weeks, the active search was officially suspended, though the case remained open. Detective Herrera promised Augustus she would continue investigating, but even she admitted
they had little to go on. Either they had an accident in an area we simply cannot access, or they chose to leave and have gone to great lengths to disappear. Neither explanation satisfied Augustus, who knew these men, their devotion to their vows, their connection to St. Benedict's. They wouldn't have left without a word, and if they'd suffered an accident, why had no trace been found? There was a third possibility that no one spoke out loud, that someone had taken them. But who would target 3 monks from an isolated monastery, and how could they have done so without leaving evidence?
As months passed without answers, various theories emerged among the police, the local community, and even within the monastery itself. Some believed the brothers had fallen into a hidden sinkhole or underwater cave system, their bodies carried away by subterranean currents. Others suggested they had planned their departure meticulously, tired of monastic restrictions and seeking freedom in the outside world. A few locals whispered about land disputes between the monastery and neighboring farms, suggesting foul play motivated by centuries-old grievances. The most disturbing theory came from an elderly villager who claimed the mountain itself was known to take people every few generations, a superstition quickly dismissed by officials, but one that lingered in the minds of those familiar with the region's folklore. For Brother Augustus, none of these explanations rang true. He continued his own investigation long after others had moved on, spending nights in the archives, searching for clues in the monastery's history. What had Matthew been researching so intently in the months before the disappearance? What significance did that bronze key hold? Why had John been exploring higher on the mountain than usual that spring? His search yielded fragments rather than answers, references in ancient texts to chambers beneath that predated the monastery's founding, mentions of a sacred place where the earliest brothers had conducted special observances during celestial alignments. Nothing concrete, nothing that explained where 3 healthy young men had gone on an April afternoon. Detective Herrero maintained contact, visiting the monastery every few months at first, then annually as the case grew colder. Despite bureaucratic pressure to focus on more recent disappearances, she continued to review evidence and follow up on occasional tips that led invariably to dead ends. Her persistence provided Augustus with a small measure of comfort. At least someone outside these stone walls still remembered, still cared. The psychological toll on the monastery community was profound. The empty cells, the gaps in the choir where 3 voices once sang, the unused garden tools all served as daily reminders of unexplained absence. 2 novices left within months of the disappearance, unsettled by what had happened. Brother Vincent, already elderly, seemed to age overnight, passing away peacefully in his sleep less than a year later. Some monks found renewed purpose in prayer, believing faith would eventually provide the answers that human investigation could not. Others, like Augustus, channeled their grief into action, maintaining the search, preserving the missing brothers' possessions, refusing to let their memory fade. The abbot, after a period of visible struggle, decreed that the monastery would continue its traditions uninterrupted, as it had through centuries of war, plague, and hardship. Life would go on, even as questions remained unanswered. At night, in the silence of his cell, Augustus sometimes thought he could hear Luke's voice joining the wind that whistled through the stone corridors, or catch a glimpse of Matthew's lanky form disappearing around a corner. But morning always brought the stark reality. They were gone, and 7 years of searching had brought him no closer to understanding why. Until the night everything changed. On a stormy June evening in 2011, Brother Augustus was cataloging a collection of 16th-century hymnals when the monastery's telephone rang.
Few calls came to St. Benedict's, particularly after dark. The ancient rotary phone, installed reluctantly in the 1970s for emergencies only, sat on a small table near the entrance, its ring echoing through the stone corridors like an alien intrusion. Augustus set down his pen and made his way through the shadowy hallway. Thunder rumbled outside, rattling the leaded glass windows as rain lashed against them in sheets. He lifted the receiver, expecting perhaps a wrong number or news of a delayed delivery. St. Benedict's Monastery, Brother Augustus speaking. Brother Augustus. The voice was familiar but tense, controlled with an undercurrent he hadn't heard before. This is Detective Herrera. His heart quickened. Detective, it's been some time. I've just received information that may be connected to your missing brothers. Augustus's free hand gripped a table edge, steadying himself. What kind of information? There was a pause on the line, the static of the storm filling the silence between them. I can't explain everything over the phone, Herrera continued, her voice tightly controlled. I need you to come to the station in Covadonga. There's someone here you should meet. Now? Tonight? Augustus glanced toward the chapel where the other brothers would soon gather for compline. Yes, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Another pause. You should prepare yourself, brother. What they found, it's disturbing. The word hung in the air between them. Disturbing. Not hopeful or promising. Disturbing. I'll be there as soon as possible, he said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. I'll send a car for you, Herrera replied. The mountain roads are treacherous in this storm. After hanging up, Augustus stood motionless, the thunder outside matching the pounding of his heart. For 7 years he had prayed for answers, had imagined countless scenarios explaining his brother's disappearance. Now that answers might be at reach, he found himself afraid of what they might reveal. His hands trembled as he wrote a note for the abbot explaining his emergency departure. As he gathered his rain cloak and changed into his sturdier sandals, his lips moved in silent prayer, not the formal Latin phrases that had structured his days for decades, but desperate, fragmented pleas for strength to face whatever waited at the police station.
The police car arrived 30 minutes later, its headlights cutting through the curtain of rain. The young officer driving said little as Augustus climbed into the passenger seat, merely nodding respectfully before navigating the vehicle down the winding mountain road. Augustus stared out the rain-streaked window, watching lightning illuminate the jagged peaks surrounding the monastery. The journey to Covadonga seemed both eternal and instantaneous, time stretching and compressing as Augustus's mind raced with possibilities. When they finally arrived at the small police station, its windows glowing yellow against the stormy darkness, he felt as though he'd been holding his breath the entire drive. Inside, Detective Herrera waited in the reception area, her face bearing the additional lines 7 years had etched there. She wore the same practical clothing he remembered, dark trousers, sensible shoes, a blazer over a simple blouse. But her eyes held something new, not just the determination he recalled, but a haunted quality that sent a chill through him. "Brother Augustus," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for coming so quickly." "Detective," he clasped her hand briefly. "What have you found?" "Not here," she replied, gesturing toward a hallway. "In my office. Dr. Marquez is waiting." She led him to a small room dominated by a desk cluttered with files and a bulletin board covered with maps and photographs. Seated in one of 2 chairs facing the desk was a woman in her early 40s, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Mud-spattered hiking clothes suggested she'd come directly from the field. "Brother Augustus,
This is Dr. Elena Marquez, leading a geological survey of the cave systems in the Picos de Europa. The woman stood, her face bearing the haunted look of someone who has seen something they cannot explain. Her handshake was firm, despite the visible fatigue in her eyes. "Brother, I wish we were meeting under different circumstances," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent of Madrid. "Please, sit down." Herrera indicated the empty chair beside Dr. Marquez. "Dr. Marquez, tell Brother Augustus what your team discovered today." The geologist took a deep breath, collecting herself. "My team has been mapping previously unexplored cave systems throughout the mountain range for the past 3 months. 2 days ago, we discovered an entrance to what appeared to be a minor cavity about 4 kilometers from your monastery." She unrolled a topographic map across Herrera's desk, pointing to a location marked with a red X. "Here." The entrance was small, partially concealed by vegetation and recently exposed rockfall. We initially thought it might connect to the larger Torca del Cerro system, but as we explored, we realized it was separate and far more extensive than we anticipated. Augustus leaned forward, studying the map. The marked location corresponded roughly to the area where the search dogs had lost the scent 7 years ago. "Today we pushed deeper into the system," Dr. Marquez continued, her finger tracing an imaginary path on the map. "After navigating several narrow passages, we discovered a large chamber, and beyond it, something that cannot be explained by geological processes." She paused, glancing at Herrera, who nodded for her to continue. "We found what appeared to be a man-made chamber, a grotto, if you will, containing items that suggest human presence, recent human presence." Augustus's heart hammered against his ribs. "My brothers." Dr. Marquez looked him directly in the eyes, her expression grave. "We found 3 sets of robes consistent with your order's garments, and remains, human remains." The room seemed to contract around him, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. "Bodies?" he managed to ask, the word barely audible. "Skeletal remains," Herrera clarified gently. "Given the arrangement and items found with them, we believe they may belong to brothers Matthew, Luke, and John. But we need you to help identify personal effects before we can be certain." Augustus closed his eyes briefly, decades of monastic discipline helping him maintain composure despite the wave of grief threatening to overwhelm him. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady. "When can we go there?" "First light tomorrow," Dr. Marquez replied. "The cave system is too dangerous to navigate in darkness, especially for someone unfamiliar with caving techniques. We've secured the site. Nothing will be disturbed before we return." "There's something else, brother," Herrera added, her voice lowering. "The scene, it's not what we would expect from an accident or natural deaths. The bodies were arranged in what appears to be a deliberate pattern around what Dr. Marquez describes as an altar-like stone formation. There were objects with them that seem ritual in nature." "What kind of ritual?" Augustus asked, dread pooling in his stomach. What had my brothers been involved in? What had they discovered in that mountain cave? "I've arranged accommodations for you tonight in town," Herrera said, breaking into his thoughts. "We'll leave for the cave entrance at dawn."
Augustus nodded mutely, trying to process everything he'd heard. After 7 years of uncertainty, he would finally learn what happened to his brothers. But the answers, it seemed, might be far more disturbing than the questions had been. The next morning dawned clear and bright. the storm having washed the world clean during the night. Augustus had barely slept, his mind churning with possibilities, his prayers finding no purchase in the darkness of his burrowed room. He'd risen before dawn and walked to the small chapel in the town square, seeking comfort in its familiar silence. By 6 a.m., he stood with Detective Herrera, Dr. Marquez, and a small team of specialists at the base of a steep trail that wound up the mountainside. The morning air was crisp, scented with pine and wet earth, birds calling in the distance as if nothing extraordinary awaited them above. "It's approximately a 2-hour hike to the cave entrance," Dr. Marquez explained, distributing equipment from the back of a rugged jeep. "The path gets steep and somewhat treacherous near the top." Augustus accepted the offered walking stick and water bottle, declining the hard hat with an apologetic smile. "I'll be fine with my hood," he said, adjusting the cowl of his robe. "I've walked these mountains for 40 years. The team began their ascent, moving in single file along the narrow trail. Augustus found himself in the middle of the group, with Dr. Marquez leading and Detective Herrera just ahead of him. As they climbed, his mind filled with memories of brothers Matthew, Luke, and John making this same journey 7 years earlier, perhaps excited by the prospect of discovery, unaware of what awaited them. The cave entrance was concealed until recently, Dr. Marquez called back over her shoulder as they paused to catch their breath at a particularly steep section. "We believe erosion from last winter's heavy rains, combined with a minor seismic event recorded in March, exposed what had been sealed for centuries." "How did you find it?" Augustus asked, wiping perspiration from his brow despite the cool morning air. "Pure chance," she replied. "We were surveying known caves in the region when one of my students noticed cold air flowing from what appeared to be solid rock. Upon closer examination, we found a narrow fissure barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through." They continued upward, the trail growing steeper, conversation giving way to the sound of labored breathing and boots crunching on loose stone. After another hour of climbing, Dr. Marquez stopped abruptly, pointing to a rocky outcropping partially concealed by juniper bushes. "There," she said, "that's the entrance." Augustus stared at the unremarkable opening, a dark slash in the gray limestone no more than half a meter wide. If one weren't specifically looking for it, it would be easy to pass by without notice, exactly as Brother John had described finding years earlier. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Herrera asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. "We can bring out any items for you to identify. You don't have to go inside." Augustus shook his head firmly. "I need to see for myself. I owe them that much." Dr. Marquez approached with additional equipment, a helmet with a mounted light, heavy gloves, and knee pads. "The initial passage is quite narrow," she explained. "You'll need to crawl for about 20 meters before it opens into a larger tunnel. From there we can walk, though the ceiling remains low in several sections." Once equipped, the team approached the entrance one by one. Dr. Marquez went first, demonstrating how to maneuver through the tight opening by lying flat and inching forward on elbows and knees. A forensic technician followed, then Detective Herrera. Augustus watched them disappear into the darkness, steeling himself for what lay ahead. When his turn came, he dropped to his knees before the narrow fissure. The rough stone immediately pressed against his shoulders. Taking a deep breath, he began to crawl forward, the beam of his headlamp illuminating just a few feet of rock ahead. The passage was claustrophobic, the weight of the mountain seeming to press down upon him. His robe caught on jagged protrusions, and cool air flowed past his face, carrying a faint mineral scent. "Keep coming, brother," Dr. Marquez's voice echoed from ahead. "It opens up just a few meters more." After what felt like an eternity of crawling, the passage widened suddenly, allowing Augustus to stand in a chamber perhaps 3 meters high. The rest of the team waited there, their headlamps creating overlapping circles of light in the darkness. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing oddly in the confined space. "This way," Dr. Marquez said, leading them towards a narrow tunnel branching off to the right. "Watch your footing. The ground is uneven and slippery in places." They proceeded in single file, their lights creating dancing shadows on the limestone walls. In some places, the ceiling dropped so low they had to stoop or crawl briefly before it rose again.
Augustus lost track of time as they ventured deeper into the mountain, the outside world feeling increasingly remote with each step. These passages show signs of having been sealed by a rockfall centuries ago, Dr. Marquez explained during a brief rest. The fallen stones had been naturally cemented together by mineral deposits, creating what appeared to be a solid wall until recent geological activity fractured it. Could someone have deliberately sealed it? Herrera asked, her detective's mind looking for human intervention. Possibly, Dr. Marquez conceded, though it would have required substantial effort and knowledge of the cave system.
They continued forward, the passage gradually widening and the ceiling rising until they no longer needed to stoop. Augustus noticed subtle changes in the cave walls, areas that seemed unnaturally smooth, as if worked by human hands. Occasionally, his light caught what might have been deliberate markings, though centuries of mineral deposits had obscured whatever patterns they once formed. After nearly an hour of careful navigation through the winding passages, Dr. Marquez paused at the entrance to a much larger space. "We are approaching the main cavern now," she said, her voice hushed. "Beyond it lies what we've been calling the Grotto, the area where we made our discovery." They emerged into a vast cathedral-like chamber, their headlamps insufficient to illuminate its full extent. The ceiling soared overhead, adorned with spectacular stalactites that had formed over millennia. Natural columns of flowstone connected floor to ceiling in places, resembling the pillars of the monastery's chapel. "Remarkable," Augustus breathed, momentarily distracted from their grim purpose by the natural beauty of the space. "The geology suggests this chamber has existed in roughly this form for at least 20,000 years, but what lies beyond appears to have been modified by human hands." She led them toward the far end of the cavern, where a smaller opening was visible. As they approached, Augustus noticed the passage had been worked into an arch, too regular to be natural. Ancient tool marks were visible in the stone, partially obscured by centuries of mineral deposits. "This is the entrance to the grotto," Dr. Marquez said, stopping before the arch. "Brother Augustus, are you ready?" He nodded, unable to form words as the moment of truth approached. Herrera moved to stand beside him, a silent offer of support that he acknowledged with a grateful glance. They ducked through the arch and entered a space unlike anything Augustus had imagined. The grotto was roughly circular, perhaps 10 meters across, with a domed ceiling from which hung a single, massive stalactite, positioned almost precisely in the center. The floor had been artificially leveled in ancient times, creating a smooth surface, interrupted only by a raised platform of stone at the center, unmistakably an altar of some kind. Their headlamps revealed the scene gradually, each new detail more disturbing than the last. 3 monks' robes lay arranged in a perfect triangle around the altar, weathered but recognizable by their distinctive dark brown fabric and the simple rope belt still threaded through their waists. The robes were not empty. Skeletal remains lay within and around them, positioned in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern rather than the random arrangement that would result from natural death. The smell hit Augustus then. A strange mixture of decay, mineral dampness, and something else he couldn't identify. Something that reminded him vaguely of church incense, but sharper, more primal. The temperature in the grotto was noticeably cooler than the main cavern, and sounds echoed differently, creating an unsettling acoustic effect that made whispers seem to come from all directions at once. "We've documented everything as exactly as we found it," said Dr. Marquez softly. "Nothing has been moved." Augustus moved forward as if in a trance, approaching the nearest robe. Despite the years that had passed, he recognized it immediately. The distinctive patch on the left shoulder where Brother Matthew had mended a care. The slightly shorter hem that always shone his ankles when he walked. Beside it lay a distinctive rosary with beads carved from olive wood, its cross worn smooth from years of handling. "This was Brother Matthew's," he said, his voice breaking. "These are his prayer beads. He carved them himself from the branch of an olive tree that grew in the monastery courtyard." He moved to the second robe, identifying it as Luke's by the subtle musical notation embroidered along one sleeve, a reminder of his role as choir director. Nearby lay a small leather-bound prayer book, its cover worn with years of use, the edges of its pages bearing the colorful tabs he had added to mark his favorite passages. The third robe belonged unmistakably to Brother John, distinguished by the small pouches sewn into its inner lining where he had carried seeds and plant specimens. His herbalist's pouch lay nearby, remarkably preserved, still containing dried plants that somehow survived the years in this controlled environment. "It's them," Augustus confirmed, grief finally breaking through his composure. "These are my brothers." While the personal items confirmed the identities of the deceased, the altar itself raised far more questions than it answered. Constructed from a single massive block of stone, different from the surrounding limestone, it bore symbols carved into its surface that Augustus didn't recognize from any Christian tradition he had studied in his decades as a monastic scholar. Surrounding the altar were objects that seemed designed for ritual purpose. Bronze bowls containing hardened substances that might have once been waxed or oils, ceremonial daggers with inscriptions in an unfamiliar script, and most disturbingly, an ancient manuscript bound in leather that appeared to have been clutched by one of the skeletons, presumably Brother Matthew, until death had loosened his grip. As the forensic team carefully documented the scene, taking photographs and samples for later analysis, initial theories began to form. The forensic anthropologist who had accompanied them conducted a preliminary examination of the skeletal remains, moving carefully around the scene to avoid disturbing evidence. Based on what I can observe without moving the remains, all three individuals appear to have died at approximately the same time. There are no obvious signs of trauma that would indicate violence or struggle. No fracture is consistent with falls or blows, no cut marks suggesting attack with weapons. "What about the positioning?" Herrera asked. "This arrangement seems ritualistic." "Definitely deliberate," the anthropologist agreed. "The bodies appear to have been positioned after death, or perhaps the individuals assumed these positions voluntarily before dying. Without a more thorough examination, I can't be certain." Dr. Marquez pointed out geological features suggesting the grotto had been used by humans long before the monastery existed. "See these smooth depressions in the floor?" She indicated areas where the stone had been worn down. "These are consistent with repeated human activity over centuries, possibly millennia. This space may have been used for pagan rituals that predated Christianity in the region." Detective Herrera examined strange markings on the cave walls. Some appeared ancient, deeply carved and partially obscured by mineral deposits, while others seemed more recent, possibly made by the brothers themselves. She photographed symbols that matched markings found in the manuscript clutched by Matthew's remains. "Brother Augustus," she called, "do you recognize any of these symbols from your monastery's records?" Despite his shock and grief, Augustus found his scholarly mind making connections to obscure texts he'd encountered in the monastery archives. "Some of them," he admitted, studying the wall markings closely. "There are references in our oldest documents to the chamber beneath and the altar of revelation that I had always interpreted as metaphorical. I never imagined—" His voice trailed off as his attention was drawn to the manuscript. The forensic technician had carefully placed it in a preservation container, but not before photographing each page as it had been found. Herrera showed Augustus these images on her digital camera. "The text appears to be in Latin, though interspersed with symbols I don't recognize." Augustus studied the images, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "It's a form of ecclesiastical Latin used in the 12th century, but corrupted with what appears to be much older symbolism.
Some of these characters resemble pre-Roman Iberian script. The team carefully extracted several pages from what appeared to be Brother Matthew's journal, found among the remains. The entries became increasingly frantic and cryptic in the final pages. March 15th, 2004. Luke believes he has identified the correct tonal sequence. When sung in the chapel's northwest corner, the acoustics reveal something extraordinary, a hollow sound behind what should be solid stone. John has found reference to a plant that, when properly prepared, opens the mind to truths beyond ordinary perception. We are close to understanding what the founders knew. April 2nd, 2004. The key I discovered hidden in the binding of the Codex Montanus opens more than just physical locks. The symbols inscribed upon it match those in the forbidden texts exactly. This cannot be a coincidence. The truth behind our order's founding is more profound than any of us suspected. April 16th, 2004. Tomorrow we make our journey. John has located the entrance described in the ancient accounts. Luke has memorized the chants that will guide our way. I carry the key that will unlock knowledge too profound to bear alone. May God forgive us if we have misinterpreted the signs. But if we are correct, we will experience what the founders experienced, direct communion with the divine. As Augustus read these passages aloud, his voice trembling slightly, Detective Herrera exchanged glances with Dr. Marquez. It sounds as though they came here deliberately, seeking something specific, Herrera observed. But what? Dr. Marquez wondered. What could drive 3 devoted monks to venture into an unexplored cave system and participate in what appears to be a ritual that resulted in their deaths? Augustus had no immediate answer, his mind wrestling with the implications of what they'd found. After decades of faithful service to the church, he now faced evidence that his brothers had been involved in practices that seemed to fall outside Orthodox Christianity. Yet something about the altar nagged at his memory, a connection he couldn't quite grasp. While examining the altar more closely, Augustus noticed something familiar about a symbol carved into its base. A small, stylized design that resembled a key with 3 prongs. "This symbol," he said suddenly, kneeling despite the protest of his aging joints. "I've seen it before. It's on our monastery's founding documents, though much smaller, just a teeny mark in the corner of the parchment. I always assumed it was simply a stonemason's mark or the scribe's signature." Dr. Marquez directed her light where Augustus indicated, revealing the carved symbol more clearly. It does appear to be much older than the other carvings. The degree of mineral deposit suggests it was carved centuries before the rest of the carvings. Augustus' mind raced back to Matthew's journal entry and the key he had mentioned finding in the archives. "The key," he said urgently. "Matthew was wearing a bronze key on a leather cord when I last saw him. Has it been found among the remains?" The forensic technician consulted her inventory of documented items. No key has been logged, though there is a leather cord among Brother Matthew's remains. "Wait," Augustus said, his gaze returning to the altar. "Look at this indentation in the stone. Could it be—" He pointed to a small, rectangular depression near the base of the altar, easily overlooked among the more prominent carvings. The depression was approximately 3 centimeters long and 1 centimeter wide, the size of a small key. "Dr. Marquez, may I—" Augustus gestured toward the altar. "Carefully," she cautioned. "This is still an active investigation scene." Augustus approached the altar, kneeling beside it. In Matthew's journal, he wrote that the key he found opens more than just physical locks. What if he meant this literally? He examined the depression more closely, noting how the surrounding stone showed subtle signs of wear, as if something had been inserted and removed multiple times over centuries. He believed there may be a hidden compartment within the altar itself. Herrera conferred briefly with the forensic team before giving permission to investigate further. Using specialized tools, they carefully probed the depression and surrounding area, documenting each step of the process with photographs and measurements.
After several tense minutes, a soft click echoed through the grotto, and a section of the altar's base shifted slightly. With extreme care, the technicians extracted what appeared to be a stone drawer hidden within the massive altar block. Inside lay another manuscript, far older than the one found with Matthew's remains, its pages brittle with age. The text was written in a cipher that combined Latin, Greek, and symbols not found in either alphabet, a deliberate attempt to conceal its contents from casual readers. But Augustus, with his decades of experience in the archives, recognized elements of the cipher from ancient monastic texts he had studied. With trembling hands, he began to translate passages, speaking aloud as the others listened in stunned silence. "We who followed Benedictus to this mountain did so believing we sought only solitude and communion with God through prayer and work. What we found beneath the sacred peak was far more profound, a direct conduit to the divine, established by those who worshipped here long before Christ walked the earth. 3 of our number discovered the ancient rites that, when performed by 3 willing souls during the celestial alignment, opened the veil between worlds. They experienced union with the divine essence that transcends all earthly understanding, a revelation so profound that return to ordinary existence became impossible for them. I alone survived to record what transpired, having served as witness rather than participant. The knowledge must be preserved but protected from those who would misuse it or condemn it without understanding. I established this monastery above the sacred chamber, appointing myself its first abbot and guardian of the secret." The manuscript continued, describing how this splinter group within the original monastic order had preserved their secret knowledge through selected members of the monastery for centuries, hidden from church authorities and even from fellow monks. It appeared brothers Matthew, Luke, and John had stumbled upon this hidden history and become obsessed with uncovering its mysteries. Back at the monastery, armed with this new understanding and permission from Detective Herrera to investigate further, Brother Augustus gained access to areas of the archives normally restricted to all but the abbot. Here, he discovered evidence that the 3 missing monks had been conducting their own research for months before their disappearance. Notes hidden between legitimate texts,
coded messages exchanged during mandatory silence periods, and references to the Grotto of Revelation painted a picture of three young men gradually drawn into an ancient mystery that had been hidden within the monastery's walls for centuries. Detective Herrera, meanwhile, interviewed the oldest living monk, 93-year-old Brother Tomas, who finally revealed that as a young man he had been approached by previous keepers of this secret knowledge, but had rejected their overtures. He had remained silent about this for decades out of fear and shame, believing the tradition had died out until the three young monks began asking unsettling questions. "They came to me first," Brother Tomas confessed, his voice barely audible, hands trembling. "Matthew showed me a text he'd found hidden in the archives and asked if I knew anything about the three who seek. I pretended ignorance, but I knew what he had found." "Why didn't you warn them?" Herrera asked gently. "I convinced myself they would abandon the search as I had," the elderly monk replied, tears forming in his rheumy eyes. "By the time I realized how determined they were, it was too late. They had already found the key." Forensic analysis of the remains revealed an unexpected cause of death. Not violence or accident, but what appeared to be self-administered poison found in residue from the bronze bowls. Chemical analysis identified a compound derived from a rare fungus that grows only in complete darkness, one that Brother John, with his knowledge of herbs, would have been able to identify and prepare. Electronic reconstruction of the damaged journal pages revealed the brothers believed they had discovered a ritual that would allow them to experience divine union, a direct communion with God that transcended normal prayer and meditation. The ritual required 3 participants, specific astronomical alignments, and willing sacrifice. As the various threads of evidence came together, a disturbing picture emerged. Brothers Matthew, Luke, and John had rediscovered ancient knowledge deliberately suppressed by the Church, rituals that predate Christianity but had been incorporated into early monastic practices before being deemed heretical. They had located the sealed grotto using Brother Matthew's historical research, Brother Luke's knowledge of architectural acoustics, which helped identify hollow spaces within the mountain, and Brother John's exploration skills. They had prepared for months, gathering supplies and studying the forbidden texts. The final journal entry, partially deciphered by linguistic experts, revealed they entered the grotto during a rare planetary alignment mentioned in the ancient manuscripts, a time when the veil between worlds was supposedly thinnest. They performed the ritual exactly as prescribed, consuming the ceremonial drink prepared by Brother John that contained the fungal compound. What they experienced in their final moments remains unknown, but forensic evidence suggests they died in states of extreme neurological activity, their brains showing patterns similar to those observed in intense religious experiences or psychedelic states. Whether they found divine revelation or simply hallucinated as they died remains ambiguous.
Most disturbing was evidence that one of the brothers, likely Matthew, survived longer than the others and attempted to record what he was experiencing. His final writings, barely legible and interspersed with unknown symbols, speak of the light beyond light and entities that exist between the spaces of our world. The monastery held a solemn funeral for the 3 brothers, their remains finally laid to rest in the limestone coffins that had waited empty for 7 years. The abbot, with guidance from Vatican authorities who took interest in the case, decided to seal the entrance to the cave system permanently. Brother Augustus struggled with complicated emotions, grief for his lost brothers, anger at their deception, and unsettling questions about his own faith. Had the monastery been built upon secrets and heresies he never suspected? Were the founders of his order seekers of forbidden knowledge rather than humble servants of God? Detective Herrera officially closed the case, classifying it as accidental death resulting from ritual suicide, though privately she remained disturbed by aspects that defied conventional explanation. The geological research team was sworn to secrecy about certain details, their papers focusing only on the scientific aspects of the cave system. The manuscripts and ritual objects were removed by Vatican representatives for further study, despite Brother Augustus's requests that they remain in the monastery archives. He was instructed not to discuss certain aspects of the discovery with the other monks to prevent spiritual confusion. 1 year after the discovery, Brother Augustus visited the graves of his 3 brothers on a quiet spring morning. He had made peace with much of what happened, but still carried questions that might never be answered. As he prayed beside their graves, he noticed something unusual. 3 seedlings had sprouted in a perfect triangle around the burial site, the same formation as the robes in the grotto. The seedlings were of a plant species that Brother John had been attempting to cultivate before his disappearance, one thought impossible to grow in the monastery's climate. Brother Augustus touched one of the seedlings and experienced a brief, intense sensation, a flash of the same light beyond light described in Matthew's final writings. The moment passed quickly, leaving him unsure if it was divine communication or simply his imagination. The story closes with Brother Augustus returning to his daily duties, carrying both his traditional faith and new uncertainties. Some questions about existence, he concluded, may not be meant for human understanding, whether sought through patient prayer or forbidden rituals. As he entered the chapel for evening prayers, he noticed for the first time in 7 years that the choir sounded complete again, though when he turned to look, only the current monks were present. The music faded as the sun set through the stained glass windows, casting prismatic patterns across the ancient stone floor, not unlike the triangular arrangement of robes found deep within the mountain's hidden heart.